heard the chair of that committee say they'll come back with a whole host of new intelligence officials. In the meantime, I want to bring in my colleague, CTV News senior political correspondent Glenn McGregor, as well as Canada's former ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, who have been listening in this afternoon. Hi to both of you. Good to have you with us. Guy, I want to start with you. Anything you heard there from those officials that kind of deflates the call for an inquiry, or do you still think one would be necessary and helpful?
Well, I still think that one inquiry would be useful. Of course, Mrs. Thomas raised important questions in terms of who can have access to information, but I would argue that we are at the stage where maybe someone like Justice Arbour would be an appropriate person, because she would be able to look at sensitive information and be able to fully assess what has been going on in terms of foreign interference. There are many questions that remain. I noticed that Mrs. Tormos-Eisen from Global Affairs, who said that, in fact, there was monitoring of what was said on in the press, and including also in foreign languages media in Canada. But there, I would like to know a lot more about how much monitoring was done on WeChat, for instance, because we know that there was a lot of activity by the Chinese to spread disinformation on WeChat. Another interesting thing that came out of the hearing so far is the fact that CSIS does not share necessarily its evidence with the RCMP. Of course, there are things that the CSIS does not want to talk about in terms of how it gathers evidence, but this creates a challenge. And in fact, if you look at the Morris Rosenberg report, he mentioned the fact that there's a need to better coordinate work between various agencies. And I would conclude also with regard to the report of Mr. Rosenberg that, in fact, he was dealing with, he had a limited mandate. And what I'm afraid of is that he has been looking at the tip of the iceberg. We now have to look at the rest of the iceberg, and I would have a few suggestions on that.
And really that leads, Glenn, to the central political question here, which is whether or not there's going to be an additional mechanism to look into the scope of this issue. The government has poured cold water on it. This testimony largely attempted to do the same thing.
And may have had the effect of doing that too. So you have the NDP and the Conservatives both saying, and with a motion before this committee, the PROC committee, calling on the government to convene a full public inquiry, listing the people they would like to see called, including Katie Telford, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and people who were involved in the election with the parties during the election. That's not going to happen. Even if that motion passes, it's in no way binding on the government to do it. They don't have to do that. I think what you heard in Jody Thomas's testimony is, if you were of that view that a public inquiry isn't the right venue, the lack of kind of information you're getting from her, first of all, because she wasn't in that role until January of 2022, after these things are alleged to have happened. And also she's saying, we just can't discuss this stuff in public, right? This is really confidential, sensitive stuff. It can't be shared publicly, and it has to be done in camera. So you could imagine a public inquiry in which a substantial part of the testimony is done in camera, people not allowed to watch on television or in the room, wondering how useful that would be, as opposed to some other model where Mr. Saint-Jacques suggests Louise Arbour, who would be an esteemed jurist, who would probably be well suited to that if she could come in and look at it. But that's not what the New Democrats want. It's not what the Conservatives want either.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I want to comment on is a sort of surprising remark by Sean Tupper, who's the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, saying the RCMP is not investigating anything from the 2021 election. That could be both more and less than what it sounds like. Generally, the RCMP never comments on whether they have an investigation underway.
That's a
one way or the other. Yeah. That was a little bit striking. But it also doesn't mean that there isn't investigations being done. Because if some of the allegations we've seen and some of the reporting by some of our other media colleagues the allegations made about, for example, busing in students to a nomination meeting, or businesses getting paid by the Chinese government to employ students to go volunteer, those will be violations of the Elections Act, which are not typically investigated by the RCMP. They're investigated by Elections Canada, and specifically by the Commissioner of Canada Elections. So that would be a good question to hear, whether they have any investigation underway, although my experience dealing with that agency is they never say one way or the other. You have to look for the paper trail and find out whether they're actually doing it.
Those comments kind of lead me also, Guy, to the point that Ms. Thomas made around intelligence not necessarily becoming evidence. And I feel like that's where a lot of the discussion ends up being, right? Because all of the reporting that's being done right now certainly focuses on intelligence that's out there. And maybe it's not evidence, but the fact that CSIS does have worries about the degree to which China allegedly attempted to interfere is, I think, what's on the face of it worrying Canadians, regardless of the fact of whether or not it's produced tangible evidence at this moment.
And I think, there are things that could be done in terms of trying to go to the bottom of this. For instance, I would assume that all the candidates maintain rosters of volunteers who came to help out. And so it would be possible to look at the names and to go to these people and ask them questions about what was their role, were they paid, and see and try to get information. Also, and maybe this is work that could be done by a good journalist, but I would like to see a statistical analysis of the results of the 2021 elections in the some 11 ridings that were the most under scrutiny. For instance, I would like to know the number of voters compared to the previous election, and also whether there were wild swings in terms of support for any candidate compared to the other ridings. Because when you look at the overall results of the 2021 election with 2019, in fact, we ended up with more or less the same result at the end, but there were a number of ridings where there were substantial change, and I think that this would confirm that these riding needs more scrutiny. I would hope also that CSIS would give enough information either to the RCMP or to the Election Commission here to further investigate whether amounts of money were given by business people to students. I think there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done. Another thing that I would like to see is a timetable. When were briefings given to the Prime Minister, and what kind of information was available at the time, and what action, if any, was taken? Because when you hear about developments in recent weeks and months, it seems like if there were no action taken by the government, and now we have this cloud over the results of the last, especially the last election, about the integrity of our system.
The committee's about to get back underway, so I just want to go to you, Glenn, for a last word. And just a couple of things to jump off what Guy said. Yeah. I thought it was interesting today that Mr. Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, was asked very directly, do you believe that the outcome of this election is in jeopardy or question? And he was unequivocal in answering.
It was no. They don't want to get put in that position where they're starting to sound like
and we have to be clear about the line too, right?
In the United States.
Yeah, and nobody's saying that at this point.
Mr. Saint-Jacques raising the issue of, what was the outcome in these 11 ridings? How did it change? It's impossible to know, even if there was, as alleged, Chinese interference of the kind that we've seen in some of the media reports, whether or not that actually made a difference in any of those ridings.
It's very hard to measure. That's what that report
yesterday said. It's impossible to measure.
And
you got to remember that the Conservative campaign under Aaron O'Toole in 2021 was very bellicose and aggressive against China generally. People who were from mainland China didn't all respond the same way to that. A lot of people may not have liked it. Remember, we heard some of the debate after Mr. O'Toole left his job about whether or not we had from a member of the party board. He was very dissatisfied in the Conservative Party's messaging against China during the campaign. He thought it cost them seats in the Lower Mainland, in British Columbia, possibly in Markham and around there in the GTA. So that's, again, you can't disaggregate all those things and say,
really
this is the
to.
Chinese interference that cost the Conservative Party this seat or cost the Liberal Party this seat in this riding. They can't do it.
I think the political question is, it's true that it's very almost impossible to disaggregate it, but I guess what the opposition is asking for is more clarity on the scope of what that interference would have.
I think everybody wants
but
that
yeah,
now.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, Mr. St. Jacques and Glenn, thank you very much, both of you, for joining me and for your analysis.